Hi, thanks everybody. This is a little bit of a different talk than I would normally give. It's more of a perspective based on a perspective paper I've been writing about the state of the field and where the field can go. And it's also a little bit more about like where I'd see my research program extending. And so though this is going to be focused on pain, I think that it holds relevance really for any type of psychological state that can become chronic. So for example, like an experience of embarrassment becoming shame, an experience of fear becoming something like PTSD or an anxiety disorder. Um, so I will begin now. Okay, so here's my talk timeline. First, I'm going to discuss what is pain and why do we need neuroimaging to study it at all. And I'll go through what's acute versus chronic pain and the heterogeneity of pain representations. Then I'm going to discuss how we can develop diagnostic models of pain using neuroimaging. And I'll discuss the pitfalls as well as some recommendations I have to make this better. And then we'll go on to treatment-related models using an idiographic approach, discuss pitfalls and recommendations there as well. On to prevention-related models. And this, I'm going to propose a novel social epidemiologic approach and discuss like the pitfalls and recommendations for that as well. And then finally, I'm going to end with implications for the patient, society, and for research as well, like what our role is in solving the issues that related to the socioeconomic contributions to chronic pain. Okay, so let's start. Pain is an unpleasant, multidimensional experience that is associated with actual or potential tissue damage. So you don't actually need to be hurt to experience pain by the definition set by IAPS. It's often described as a threefold process that's consisting of sensory discriminative, cognitive evaluative, and affective motivational components. These three components encompass a wide variety of factors that include, but are not limited to, nociception, attention, learning, memory, expectations, your personality, culture, and your socioeconomic conditions. So very briefly, we perceive acute pain when some type of noxious stimulus activates sensory neurons under our skin. The sensory neurons bundle up to form the dorsal root ganglion and then project to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Projection neurons in the dorsal horn then send information to the brainstem, specifically the parabrachial nucleus and the pariequital gray, and then to the thalamus. And from the thalamus, it gets projected to sensory discriminative areas of the brain, including the primary and secondary somatosensory cortices. Affective motivational regions like the amygdala, basal ganglia, and insula, and cognitive evaluative regions like the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex. Some of these regions comprise what's known as the descending modulatory pain system, which interacts with nociceptive signaling in a top-down manner that can vary across individuals and contexts. And there's even evidence that the descending modulatory pain system can influence activity all the way down to the spinal cord. So you can imagine that this high-level information now is adjusting weights all the way back down to primary sensation. And it's important to note that what we report as pain is emerging from activity across all the brain, and that this activity can persist without any peripheral input at all. So for example, there was a construction worker who fell and landed on a nail and it went through his boot, and he was in excruciating pain and got to the ER, and they took off his boot and his pain went away immediately because everybody saw that the nail actually went through the shoe but did not actually stab his foot. So he experienced real pain, like he was experiencing pain, but it actually didn't hurt him. So it was based on his expectations. And that's also why placebo effects work as well, right? So when the brain level pain representation is persisting long after the site of injury has healed, it's known as chronic pain. And chronic pain is a very serious condition. It's actually the #1 cause of disability worldwide. It affects 1 out of every 5 people on this planet. Acute and chronic pain are quite different. Acute pain is provoked by a specific disease or injury, while chronic pain, as we were just describing, arises from potentially psychological states and is a disease state itself. Acute pain is self-limited. It lasts from 3 to 6 months. while chronic pain outlasts the normal time of healing and it has no recognizable endpoint, though it's thought to start around the 3 to 6 month time point. Acute pain serves as an immediate biological purpose, usually withdrawal from a dangerous stimulus. Chronic pain doesn't have a clear or immediate biological purpose, and I think people have, thought of it as something with no biological purpose, but I think that there could be some, that it might be involving more complex associations of danger in your wider social environment. And acute pain primarily activates nociceptive and somatic circuitry, while chronic pain activates primarily emotion-related and limbic circuitry. Finally, acute pain is praised as temporary by the person and considered separate from the self. I don't think we really associate ourselves with like a pinprick, right? But chronic pain actually is appraised as unending and becomes a part of your life. People with chronic pain associate their sense of self, like who they are, with the pain that they experience. Okay. So I think that neuroimaging is necessary for our ability to understand and to treat pain, because it's clear that pain is in the brain and that it involves sites well beyond nociceptive processing, and that it's a highly multidimensional process. And there's just to date no other biological or physiological signal with that degree of dimensionality that could serve as an appropriate biomarker for pain. So for example, skin conductance, responses, heart rate, and facial expression are just not sensitive or specific enough to be biomarkers of pain. Also, the pain representation itself in the brain is highly heterogeneous. It varies across individuals, even in acute pain, where there is like an explicit external stimulus. And it varies across chronic pain conditions and then within patients in chronic pain. So this high dimensionality makes it very difficult for us to develop biomarkers for pain. But the positive flip side of this dimensionality is that it creates many more access points for us to target with interventions. So for example, pharmacological treatments could target, primary nociception or sensation, while educational interventions could target cognitive and evaluative networks. And socioeconomical interventions could maybe change affective and motivational networks. Okay, so the biopsychosocial model of pain summarizes what we were just talking about, and it states that to understand pain, we may have to understand the whole person, their relationships, and society as well. And chronic pain treatment effect sizes seem to support this. Multidisciplinary rehabilitation centers that combine things like physical therapy as well as CBT and mindfulness, sometimes also art and music and social support programs, tend to have the highest treatment effects, but they are the least studied. And though this model makes a lot of sense, it is theoretical and it's ill-defined, and it's largely treated as an afterthought in like the implications and discussion sessions of pain neuroscience papers. So what I'm trying to do here today is to formalize this more with a threefold modeling approach that we can use in neuroimaging. Okay. So the threefold approach first involves the standard way of developing biomarkers in neuroimaging, which is a population nomothetic approach, which involves developing pain neuroimaging biomarkers for diagnostic purposes. And in this approach, neuroimaging model weights are going to be estimates of the population level associations between the brain activity and some pain outcome, which could be self-reported pain intensity. And then the second level here would take a less popular idiographic or person-based approach to develop treatment relevant models. And in this approach, neuroimaging model weights are going to be estimates of the person level associations between brain activity and pain outcomes for that person through time. And the last approach I'm calling a social epidemiologic or structured based approach. that'll be for the development of a prevention-related model, and it'll involve 2 steps of modeling. The first is to model one's socioeconomic structure with a survey that I'll discuss. And then the idea would be to take the survey and relate it to the brain activity, so that we can develop a neuroimaging model where the weights in this approach are estimates of group level associations between one's socioeconomic conditions and the pain related brain activity that they're experiencing. And we can then use a map like this to further regularize idiographic models of pain. I'll break that down later. Okay, so let's begin discussing diagnostic models. So the nomothetic approach to neuroimaging models is when we train across multiple people to predict some pain-related outcome from their brain activity. And so this uses multivoxel pattern analysis, or MVPA, meaning all the voxels are going into one model. And then they're trained using machine learning algorithms. The most popular ones are linear regression-based ones like Lasso PCR, or categorical ones like support vector machines. The models are then cross-validated using an iterative leave X subjects out procedure. And this is done at the time of training to assess the performance on out-of-sample participants. And then they're validated on held out validation sets, but this external validation process is often not so common in a single neuroimaging study just due to the demands on sample size, but it tends to happen across a series of papers. So an example of this is the NPS, or the neurologic pain signature. It was trained on healthy participants to predict their acute pain responses. So it can predict a subject's subjective pain rating. And it's been well validated, and its receptive field is known. And that means that it's specific to acute pain from what we can tell so far. Of different modalities, though it was trained on heat pain, it can detect distension pain, cold pain, as well as noxious pressure and electric shocks. It's also independent of the bodily site of stimulation, but it's not activated by negative affect or pain empathy or warmth. Okay. And the NPS is just one component of pain. And what I mean by this is that if we take a component process approach to pain, we assume that there are multiple different components that contribute to the pain experience, like nociception, attention, memory, etc. And they can be combined in very different ways to substantiate any individual's pain experience. This is analogous to color, which may be made up of 3 components, say red, green, and blue, that can be combined in various ways to form a virtually infinite number of colors. So another example of a component of pain that was developed in Tor's lab is the SIP signature, or a stimulus independent pain signature. And this signature is a component of pain activity that is not predicted by the actual stimulus intensity. When the NPS and this signature are combined to predict an individual's pain ratings, they explain more of the variance in that person than either one alone. However, to combine, they only explain 30%. And so that's good relative to how these models are performing overall, but 30% still isn't enough, right? So this indicates that more components are needed. Furthermore, a huge problem here, and why neuroimaging has yet to impact the clinic, is the NPS does not detect chronic pain. The NPS was trained on only 20 people, only 8 of which were women, and 79% were white. The socioeconomic status is not reported, but you can assume that it's high, relatively higher than the population at large, and especially higher than what chronic pain patients usually are. Because it's the people that are involved in the study were recruited from the campus on Columbia. Okay, so there has been an attempt to apply the NPS to predict chronic pain, and though it's unclear whether any model of evoked pain will actually be able to inform the diagnosis of chronic pain, there is some promise. So here the NPS was reduced to just its positive components, and then combined with another signature that was trained on fibromyalgia patients to predict evoked pain in them. And then another another pattern called a multisensory pattern that's similar to the SIP signature. And the three of them combined could then distinguish between a fibromyalgia patient from a healthy control. So this is interesting, but it's a lot of finagling to get to this prediction, right? And it's only established like within this one sample. And one thing to think about here is fibromyalgia is mostly in women. The sample here is women only. If we think about the MPS being trained on only 8 women, maybe it isn't actually being informative here because it just doesn't have enough representation. Okay. So here's a quick summary of the nomothetic approach. The current problems are that evoked pain paradigms do not translate well to chronic pain. Small training samples are usually underrepresentative of the true population, especially of clinical populations. And post-hoc decisions during the model combination phase are prone to overfitting. So the recommendations that I make here is to focus more on tonic paradigms of pain and validate them always in a clinical sample. So it can be harder to train models or to work with clinical patients, but you can still do this in a tonic setting. So you can do a capsaicin on the tongue and have a longer phase. Yeah, there's a question.
Yeah, just to clarify, for the MVPA studies, do they just throw the whole brain data or sort of like a searchlight approach?
Oh, so it's not a searchlight. They usually use the whole brain. MPS actually was limited to regions that were pre-selected based on neurosynth for being relevant for pain processing. And I believe SIPs excluded sensory regions. So didn't involve like somatosensory, and I think visual was excluded.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And the second recommendation is to increase the representation of race and socioeconomic status in our population samples, as well as to continue to search for more components of pain and pre-register the plans for model combinations when we're going to apply them to chronic pain diagnosis. Okay, so now we're moving on to the idiographic models. The direction of effects from group averages don't necessarily reflect the direction of effects within individuals. So the classic example for this is if we look at the population level relationship between typing speed and typos, it's a negative relationship overall. So I'm going to pause for a question.
Sorry, you may get to this. I just think this is so interesting and necessary. But I was wondering, like, do you have an idea of like where like pain not otherwise specified or something like that would be, do you have that as a category? Because it might be like it will be heterogeneous, but I'm wondering because there are just so many people who it's really hard to describe their pain, and there's like no, as you've been saying, like there's no like biological test for it. And I guess a lot of people will then be grouped into another category where it's not exactly the right diagnosis.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Maybe let me go to the end of this and then bring that question back up if I don't completely answer it. But yeah, right now it's hard to diagnose it overall, except by like the way people report their symptoms. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a negative relationship here, but intuitively, we know that when people type faster, they don't usually make fewer mistakes, but that's what this is saying here, right? What it's really actually capturing is that skillful typers tend to type faster. And so if we do an idiographic approach here and look at the relationships within person, we see that the direction of the effect actually goes in the other direction. It's positive, where people who make more mistakes when they type faster, where people are going to make more mistakes when they type faster, regardless of their skill. Okay. And so we know that the pain experience is personal, but we don't know so much about what's happening at the individual versus the population level at all. But we do know that biomarkers for acute pain aren't explaining all the variants and that there is a lot of heterogeneity. So this indicates that the pain might be a personal experience, and we should use the idiographic approach to understand it, especially when we're dealing with patients. So one way of doing this then is to train an idiographic model in the same manner that we described training the population-based models. But here you're just going to take several samples, so several trials from one person. And luckily, recent evidence suggests that brain activity within an individual, especially within networks, is stable across time for up to a few months at least to the same task. So that was found by Grattan et al. In 2008. And so this approach is going to require many samples from one patient in order to develop a good enough model. And this can be uncomfortable and impractical for pain patients. So therefore, a nice way around this by using limited data is to boost the training data through a group regularization technique. And so the way you can do that is you get your idiographic map here. And then you can actually constrain it with a shrinkage factor that you can choose based on the ratio of the within or idiographic model variance and the between or nomothetic subject variances, and then apply it to the model's weights. And that's called GRIP in this framework, which is group regularized something prediction. I forget what the I stands for. And then if we look at how well this model does in comparison to the MPS alone and in comparison to a pure idiographic model, we see that it consistently outperforms both of them. So once an idiographic model is validated for a patient, we can then objectively track their disease or treatment progress through time. And so in this example here, less expression of their idiographic pattern for pain would be indicative of more healing. And if we wanted to get really high tech with this, we can actually apply this pattern in a real-time fMRI paradigm where participants can get live feedback on their brain representation of pain and attempt to downregulate it as they practice new techniques like CBT or mindfulness, which can be very hard for people to do for the first time. So they can get real feedback in real time, potentially by like a disc shrinking as their signature decreases in activation to know if they're doing it right. Okay, and now we're at prevention, which we're good on time. So there's a lot to unpack here. And maybe I'll just pause and say, like, I've been reading a lot on the history here, and it's incredibly striking to me because when I was in Tor's lab, I had a very like bodily based focus on pain, and I didn't think so much about that pain could actually be a construct of society, you know. And then I started reading the literature on this, and it goes back to the 1800s. But there's very little conversation between more like sociologists and neuroimagers when it comes to pain. So I wanted to bridge that gap a little bit with this. So pain is the leading cause of global disability. It disproportionately affects developing nations. It disproportionately affects countries with high income inequality. It disproportionately affects women versus men, which could also be a bias of women, you know, being more open to talking about their pain. Sometimes men are less willing to discuss their pain because of like toxic masculinity aspects, societal aspects of that. But so from one study here, this was actually a really large study in the US that tracked mean pain status over the course of 12 years. And so they found here the demographic effects: women were experiencing more pain than men. And then also that people with low income or low social status were experiencing more pain than richer people. So that was split out in quartiles there. Also, same effect with low education. And in some cases, it disproportionately affects people of color. There's a lot of conflicting reports here, though. The CDC put out a recent report where it actually is disproportionately affecting white people in the US. But a lot of this is probably confounded due to it being more about socioeconomic status and not really about race. Okay, it's also more prevalent in rural than urban environments, and this is likely because it's associated more with blue-collar work. And then in another study, we see it disproportionately affects homeless people as well as renters versus property owners. In this study, a large sample was taken from ER patients in a Minnesota trauma center, and they were asked about their chronic pain status as well as other chronic illnesses. And so we find here that those making less than 25K a year and people without health insurance as well have a higher incidence of chronic pain. However, it doesn't seem to be reducible just to access to care or just to income. Chronic pain prevalence does not seem to be reducible to access to healthcare. One of the best predictors of chronic low back pain is not really injury or posture or overuse, but workplace dissatisfaction tended to be this survey measure that again and again across studies from the late 80s to the early 2000s being the best predictor from the transition of acute to chronic pain. And I think at the time, biased doctors and researchers saw this and they thought that people were lying to get disability. But as more research has been conducted and like better questionnaires have been developed, they found a better predictor is really workplace discrimination. So people who experience discrimination in their workplace based on their social identity were more likely to transition from acute to chronic pain. And in this really interesting study from a very large sample in South Korea, they found that though perceived discrimination might have been the same in different workplaces, workplaces that were unionized had less of an incidence of chronic pain than non-unionized workplaces. And I think this is really interesting. I mean, so unions do increase your salary because you have collective bargaining rights and access to care. You tend to get better insurance benefits. But another thing unions can do is that they increase your sense of control over your environment and over your workplace environment. What you can do in order to improve your own conditions, you actually have some material power now. So it's possible that unions are changing people's expectations for care and safety in their environment, which could be mentally protective against the development of chronic pain. And the reason why I think that's also possible is because chronic pain is thought to be a learned shift. So we were talking about how acute pain is primarily rooted in the nociceptive processes, and then chronic pain is primarily rooted in the affective motivational processes. This shift seems to be learned through time. And so an example model of this could be if somebody got injured at work and then they went back to their workplace, they could be triggered to cue up the pain representation by being in the context of which they were injured, right? But then say they have to stand for long periods of time and that's exasperating the injury. And then perhaps maybe because they're stressed out, they're underperforming and then they are stressed out and their boss is stressing them out, and then the boss becomes a trigger for pain. And then they try to hang out with their friends, but their friends want to go on a hike. And so now just seeing their friends triggers their pain because they don't want to be mobile. And then they start to withdraw. And then if depression increases there, it just becomes this negative cycle and the chronic pain can increase. So in various ways, a person's life may become integrated with their pain experience through time. And then depressed mood, negative pain beliefs, and early beliefs that pain might be permanent are also predictive of the shift to chronic pain in both neck and back pain. And then so I started doing a lit review here, and I was really impressed. But there's a striking overlap between the circuitry that's implicated in the transition from acute to chronic pain and the circuitry that's implicated in socioeconomic stress and childhood poverty. And like both of these literatures, I think, are very new, right? So there isn't a lot of information there. But from what exists right now, we know that the transition from acute to chronic pain is marked by a change in activity between the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens. This has been shown not just in chronic lower back pain patients with functional brain activity, but also in animal models of neuropathic pain. And then we also know that the default mode network is disrupted in chronic pain patients. And this leads to this theory that chronic pain becomes embedded in self-referential processing. And if we look at the socioeconomic status neuroimaging work, we find really similar results where in functional studies of self-referential processing and valuation implicate the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia as being modulated in activity based on one's socioeconomic status. Also, there are differences in gray matter size in those areas, possibly due to increased stress during childhood poverty. And there's also default mode network disruption that's been noted for people with low socioeconomic status. Another interesting thing, though, is that some of these things have been found to be reversible in people that actually made larger income later in life. Okay. So there are very few neuroimaging studies that have integrated income into this model at all, but there is one that's pretty interesting. It's only part of the study from Apkarian's lab. They are developing these neurotraits, they call it, based off pain personality traits. And they're really interesting networks that are predictive of chronic pain. This is chronic back pain in the study. But then one thing that they did was look at the expression of these different neurotraits of pain based off of the income they had of participants. And they found that there was a division within chronic pain patients of the expression of this pain-related neurotrait at the 25K mark, and that this division was independent of both gender and education. So they're showing that there's actually, within chronic pain patients, some protective effect of making more than 25K a year. So to address this striking relationship between one's socioeconomic status and their chronic pain, I propose this twofold social epidemiological approach. So the first idea is to standardize and collect a multidimensional survey that assesses socioeconomic status. And this is going to assess many different aspects of things because income alone isn't enough to look at it. You can be making low income and be a graduate student, but maybe have like wealth from family, right? And so it's a different kind of situation than if you were making low income and you didn't have any wealth to draw on other than that. There's a striking correlation, I didn't show data here, of debt and chronic pain, as well as debt and depression and suicide rates. We already know income, your economic class, and your relation to production. So for example, if you own a business or small business owner versus if you work for a business, your investments and savings, education level, parents' education level also tends to be predictive of some of these things, and that's related to your class structure. Perceived social status can be maybe even more important than your actual social status. So how much trust you have in your environment, and how much you expect, how fair you think things are, pretty much, right? Your housing status, childhood attachment patterns, and then also income inequality within that person's country, independent of what their actual income is. And so the idea here is to develop a model that's predictive of pain intensity just based on this multidimensional survey information. And we can train it in a similar way that we train brain maps. So that's just a cartoon example of that. And then this on its own could have prevention utility that's actually more scalable than neuroimaging on its own as well, because it's just a survey and doesn't depend upon the collection of fMRI data. But what we might be able to do is use something like this to predict someone's risk of developing chronic pain based on their environment. We can also use this to then build a socioeconomic related component process model of pain potentially. So what we could do then is then use the survey model to cluster subjects by this socioeconomic trait, and then train a neuroimaging model to predict someone's socioeconomic status based on their pain-related brain activity. And then that could essentially become this new component of pain that we can then add to these models to try to predict someone's pain experience, or also to regularize an idiographic model for their treatment. Okay, so we're getting to implications, and I went through that actually faster than I thought. But yeah, so let's try to tie this all together now, how this works in the biopsychosocial model of pain. So a person comes in and they're complaining about their back pain. We can apply the non-ethically derived diagnostic models to then diagnose their pain experience. Right now, there aren't too many of these, but there is one for chronic lower back pain. And then we collect the profile survey using the social epidemiologically derived model to assess their risk of chronic pain. And we can even then potentially match their profile based off potentially a history of people's profiles that might exist at this point to recommend treatment approaches to see which treatments work best for people with a similar profile. And then we can track their treatment progress with the idiographically derived model. Okay, and so then this is the bigger discussion question that I was really excited to have with this group. As I was reading about this too, going back to the 1800s, the earliest thing I could find was coming from these French physicians. A lot of them were pioneering sanitation for the first time, but they were saying that it wasn't, we couldn't just end at sanitation as social change for people's health. And so one big quote that came out of that was, diseases depend on the mistakes of society, which is pretty interesting. This idea that you can't just treat a disease by, even if it's caused by a bacteria, just treating the bacteria doesn't help, because if you send the person back into a sick society, so potentially if this bacteria is rampant because of sanitation issues or because of overcrowding, or maybe because people have an increased risk if they have malnutrition issues, et cetera, then are we really curing a patient if we send them back into an environment that is going to make them sick again? That was the question that they were trying to resolve. And so the interesting thing here is that it seems like income inequality and maybe like exploitation of labor is related to this chronification of pain. And if we look at where we're headed socioeconomically, this is only increasing, and income inequality is only increasing across the globe. And it's becoming harder and harder for social mobility to exist and be feasible. So what is our role here? How do we help to treat chronic pain if the person will just go back into society? How do we advocate for people as scientists? I know we're not clinicians, we're not doctors, but as scientists, how do we advocate for people at the level of public policy? And what do we do in terms of our methods to make sure we're adequately studying these things so that we can inform public policy somewhere down the line? And this came from, I was reading about Virchow. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him here. So he was a physician in the 1800s who was commissioned by the Prussian government to study their typhoid epidemic. I think this is interesting because it relates to COVID as well. But they wanted him to go there and study and figure out what was going on and issue a treatment. Many people were dying. And he studied it for 3 weeks, and he wrote this 100-page report, incredibly detailed. And the last 20 pages are just some of the most radical things I've ever written, and so applicable today, where he, first he talks about all the actual causes of it. Most of it was due to a malnutrition issue that was making them more susceptible. But he saw that it was the poor, that the working class, especially weavers, who were being disproportionately affected by it. And so among his recommendations for treating it was to shift the tax burden off the poor and onto wealthy landowners, and have the government provide nutritious food for people. Is a phenomenal report that actually caused a lot of issues, and he was ignored and like low-key exiled from Berlin for a bit, and later he was allowed to come back. But yeah, so one of the quotes from that is, disease is only a manifestation of life under pathological conditions. Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. So that's my whole talk, and we have like 15 minutes left. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and also any questions you have about the models. Yeah. Should I call on people, or there's only one person with a hand raised, so just go ahead. Or two.
Hi, Marianne.
Hi.
Yeah, really beautiful stuff. This is obviously a very important issue. And I had 2 questions, if that's okay, 2 quick ones.
Yeah.
The first one is there any relation between like chronic inflammation and chronic pain?
Yeah, there is a connection. I don't know the details of that very well, but yes. And I think that's also related to the socioeconomic work as well, that then might relate to like the changes in brain matter.
Yeah. And the second question is, in thinking about the idiographic approach, which I think is really important, what are your thoughts on, in terms of the state that you'd want to acquire the brain data from? So it could be, you put people under some painful condition, or is it more that you want to know, like having them in a state where they're activating the beliefs that they have or expectations about pain? Or do you want to measure like across a variety of different task states and then get something that's like context independent? Like, what are your thoughts on like what's the most useful there?
Yeah. Okay. The ideal, right? Like the money would be if you can capture their spontaneous pain, right? Which is really hard to do. They'd have to be lying on the scanner and eventually maybe they experience pain. We can capture that in their ratings, right? But you probably wouldn't get enough trials. There's a new study that I didn't include in here, but it provoked tonic pain. So you can still evoke the pain stimulus, but it lasts for a long enough time that it's actually potentially activating what you were saying, these concepts and things. Now you start ruminating, right? So as long as you can, I think, get the pain experience to go on for long enough that they ruminate, you might be able to capture enough unique variants that is more relevant to the experience of chronic pain.
Great.
Yeah. Oh, and that model that I was describing did distinguish between chronic back pain patients and controls, and it was a tonic pain stimulus that had to do with burning on the tongue, So,
Thanks.
yeah. I don't know how to like see everyone's names and stuff. So who has their hands raised. Do you want to just go and I'll just, yeah.
I'd be also happy to moderate, but I saw that you have a good handle on it, so I raised my own hand, but I can definitely help.
Oh, well, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question. So when you were talking about the NPS model, you mentioned that it was predicting pain, different types of pain, but specifically not negative affect.
Yeah.
And then later, as you're talking about how chronic pain relates to all these social factors, a lot of them seem to me like income, debt, education, social economic status. All of these all kind of seem to me to be environmental stressors of some kind, and they could or lack of support systems, and they could all have some negative affect, basically like that is shared among them, and that could lead into this chronic pain circuit. So I was wondering, how do you think about dissociating chronic pain from negative affect and how they're interacting with each other?
Yeah, I don't think you can fully dissociate chronic pain from negative affect. I think negative affect will be a critical component to it, more so than for acute pain, which is what the NPS is trying to predict. But I think maybe an interesting way of getting at that is to develop essentially a signature of pain catastrophizing, because that gets the negative affect that's also specific to pain. And then you can imagine socioeconomic status would impact one's pain catastrophizing, because if you are scared about your access to support, or if you can no longer work if you are in pain and now you just don't know what's going to happen, you're more likely to catastrophize. And then that could then promote the chronification of pain. Yeah.
I think the next person with the hand up is Brian.
Okay, great. Yeah, so cool to see all this multi-level thinking. I was curious about a specific thing that you said about the relationship of let's see if I get this right, of sort of the group level correlation versus the individual level correlation. You gave the typing speed example, which was interesting. But a long time ago, Jack Block said to me, what I'm trying to find are the variables that work within individuals and across individuals. So with respect to the pain signature, is it the case that it is the same direction across people? So say I experience more pain than you, then I have a stronger pain signature. But then you prick my finger versus whack my foot with a hammer. That signature within me will also be stronger for the hammer versus the pin.
Yeah.
So are they aligned actually? If they were aligned, then that would bode well for aligning the sort of the group and the idiographic signatures.
Yeah. For the MPS, they are aligned. I think that's true. I don't know about the other components, but I think your reasoning makes a lot of sense.
It would be cool to find out. I mean, and you could.
Yeah, we could. I think developing the idiographic models too can then help to build better group level models, because we will have more and more data to build upon and to train the group level.
Lucy?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I guess this sort of goes back to, it's connected to what Layli brought up. So you discussed at length socioeconomic disadvantage as linked to chronic pain. And I'm wondering, especially sort of as you go about measuring these environmental variables, if you think that it's something specific about socioeconomic adversity, or whether it's life adversity in general, and sort of what kinds of adversity. So, you know, sort of this deprivation of sufficient, you know, material or social support, or also, you know, sort of harmful, threatening life events that contribute to this.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether, you know, it's at sometimes measures of socioeconomic status can just simply be sort of proxies of risk for those other kinds of experiences, but they can also sometimes reflect like the actual nature of an experience that could cause the pain.
Yeah, so a lot of those studies do control or look at like life stress independent of economic status, but it's the economic status that remains the strong predictor. I think in this situation, it's important because it's related to like their perceptions of safety and ability to have resources. Chronic pain, if you become disabled, is going to affect your ability to work, right? And so if you can't work, and now that means that you don't have health insurance, or you can't work, and that means you can't, you know, feed your family or whatever else is going on because you're at a lower social status, I think it will increase the catastrophizing and increase the stress much more than if you know, can't work anymore, but you have access to resources. So I think, yeah, the adversity is part of it, but I think it's really more like the actual threat to your ability to provide for yourself and your family. Yeah.
Sorry, I just had a couple other questions, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to quickly ask too, like you discussed how, you know, there's no clear physical cause of chronic pain often, and that it's linked to, you know, affective networks in the brain. And I was wondering about the level of measurement for the physical etiologies. So for example, like things like holding muscles for prolonged periods of time in subtle ways that could contribute to body pain. Are people conducting measurements at that level to understand how something like negative affect contribute to sort of like how you're holding your muscles? And so there could be an actual physical cause. It's just linked to the negative affect.
Yeah, I don't know about like the clenching. I think that there probably is some work on that. The more like striking one is avoidance. People are afraid to move the site of injury, which then will exacerbate the injury and prevent healing. A lot of like the rehab programs, especially the multidisciplinary ones, work on the fear of movement, and then also work on physical therapy for movement. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yohai?
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. That is really, really interesting and sort of like different than what I'm often been exposed to, and I appreciate that a lot. Going a little bit back to the questions from Layli and Lucy, first I was wondering whether the suggestion here is that socioeconomic status is causal, or is it a moderator? Is it making the effects of chronic pain just that much harder to endure, or is it causing the chronic pain? And relatedly, whether you think that this shared networks that you've shown us before with other causes of stress or SES and stress, are those picking up on something that's maybe more general, like suffering, and then chronic pain is its own unique thing that is added to this overall suffering network?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know if it, yeah, I maybe wouldn't go as far to say suffering on those, just because I don't think they're so specific. When I look at those, I think like chronic stress, like they're like, this is like the byproduct of like cortisol being dysregulated and your like system being washed with it constantly. But yeah, so I think it's a chronic stress effect that probably has like immune issues as well involved. And then I'm trying to think, what was the other part that you asked me earlier? Is it causal, right?
Or interactive, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to use the word causal. I mean, part of me wants to, but like, I don't think I could have the evidence for that. And I don't think that would be true. Like, we are embodying that environment, right? Whatever our socioeconomic status is, if we are embodying it in our brains. And I think that by the fact that we can see improvement in people by the way that they change their cognition and their appraisals of things, independent of whether they change their material conditions, shows that it's not like, you know, the only thing. However, it's probably much harder to change a belief about, you know, pain prevalence and safety if you don't have like material evidence that you will be able to have healthcare or something, right? So it's like these things will interact, because I don't think you can change deep-seated beliefs if you don't have real evidence. But if you can learn ways of controlling things, or acceptance, if you can't control it, I think that you do have the ability there to better the condition and to change things, because you're changing the valuation system that is involved, I think. And then also maybe helping to separate yourself from the concept of pain, which also seems to be like maybe a causal mechanism in the brain. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Neelam?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I want to underscore what Brian said about your portrayal of the multi-levels of thinking and trying to get the different levels of analysis all together and to align them somehow theoretically. I'm curious, because of my time orientation, then sort of what is the time length of chronic pain? How long does it have to be chronic? And then if it's chronic, can it change? And hearing you describe about the processes by which the chronic pain emerges or how a person deals with it, to me, it sounds like it's a construct that actually is a within person changing construct. Some days I have more chronic pain than other days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it does change. There are fluctuations within individuals. Most chronic pain is spontaneous. And so it's really hard to pinpoint what is triggering it. But yeah, so I think like if there are multiple triggers of the pain representation in your environment, that you're more likely to experience the chronic pain. People do experience chronic pain relief. And when they do, you do see a reversal in some of the network changes that were found by Aparian as being related to chronic back pain. I think I forgot the first part of your question.
You know, that's what I was after. But to me, then does that suggest that maybe there's also like a pain sensitivity construct about that the changes that happen in my environment might affect me more? I'm sensitive to those, my pain is sensitive to those, versus another person might have exactly the same changes in their environment, but they might not be as sensitive to it.
Yeah.
And there might be something to grab out of the covariances there.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
There's also a question in the chat from Lucy about the gender differences and whether they emerge only after puberty and or after the first childbirth.
Well, I don't know. That's really interesting. I'm not sure. There might be data of that around. I guess just a brief story. I've done studies of acute pain and especially acute pain in social support contexts. And when you look at the research there, it's almost always studied in women. And so when I was in grad school developing my first study there, I didn't think there would be any gender effects. I thought that was like irrelevant. So I was like, I'm gonna recruit a full sample. I absolutely found gender effects in self-reported pain, self-reports for pain. And the interesting thing was that you couldn't find those same effects in their physiology. And so I think the gender effects might be more due to the fact that societal roles impact our way of perceiving resources and getting help. Not to go too far into all of this, but if you look at some of Panksepp's work, when you make a vocal cry, an alarm cry, well, animals, when they make an alarm cry, there's a release of opioids in the periaquidal gray. And so there's actually a pain relief when you call for help. And so you can imagine that calling for help is useful and gets reinforced, but it's reinforced usually mostly in women. When men call for help in our society, they are seen as, you know, weak or something, right? And so it's negatively valued. So I think that the gender effects we see in chronic pain might be due more to women seeking treatment more and feeling more comfortable about talking about their pain, and men avoiding treatment. But I'm not fully sure.
Matt?
Thanks. I assume that in terms of the brain models that the signatures you were talking about were based on activation magnitude. And I wonder if there's any role in thinking about communication patterns. Just going back to like the top-down model you presented at the beginning, I could imagine like flow from default mode network regions all the way flowing down to the brainstem. And it's really the communication that's carrying the information about, you know, maladaptive beliefs all the way down and triggering the pain, as opposed to just who's, you know, more active than, you know, what other region. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know. I wonder if there's like, if you could like monitor that at the level of the spinal cord potentially. If you could, it would be a great biomarker, right? Because then it's like a simpler signal to grab. And then also for treatment, maybe because you could do like stimulations. I don't know, but yeah, that's really interesting. There has to be like some point where all that information integrates into potentially some output. But at the same time, I think like your pain experience doesn't necessarily have to go back to the spinal level, right? Even if it does change weighting back down to the way that you're sensing it at the periphery. At this point, when it's chronic, it's a psychological state, so it doesn't need to be dependent upon the peripheral input or spinal activation, I think.
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty cool though.
Great, so we are at time. Thank you so much, Marianne, again for a very thought-provoking talk.
Thanks.
Yeah, we'll keep the room open for if other people want to hang out and ask questions. Otherwise, see you next week. Thank you all for joining.